You're listening to the Co-Creator Network. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Why Shamanism Now, a practical path to authenticity with your host, Christina Pratt, Director of the Last Mask Center for Shamanic Healing. She's talking about how shamanic skills can bring us to physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being, especially when nothing else can. Now, here's your host, Christina Pratt.
Hi, everyone. This is Langston Kahn this week. I'm going to be interviewing Christina today, but I wanted to start with our usual prayer. So let's just take a moment to ground into our bodies and center in the present moment. I call in the earth, that great original dreamer, to help us this day as we seek to learn how we can come back into relationship with each other in a way that humanity can actually be a force that is in service to all of life, that is tending and nurturing all of life. Please help us to remember that dreaming this day. I call out to the elements, those sacred building blocks of all creation. Please help us to move out of the human complexity we can get so stuck in and back into a sense of instinctual primal simplicity that allows us to be in the vast diversity of all of life and be a flowing part of it versus just sort of a clog in the pipe. We call you in, air and spirits of the East. Please help us to honor our connection to our clarity of heart, that ability to feel that sense of spacious vision as we move on the path of the dream we fell so in love with. We decided to come to earth to manifest it. Help us to move into relationship with our true nature. We call you in, spirits of the South and fire. Help us, fire, to honor and embody that full heart that is deeply connected to our true passions and longings and not hijacked by the false cravings and addictions inspired by our culture, but rather a trustworthy vehicle for us to be in relationship with our divinity and our humanity through our body. Help us, fire, to make a way for ourselves in the world as you do. We honor you and we thank you. And I call out to you, spirits of the West and water. Water, please help us to keep our hearts open. Help us to be courageous enough to move into the depths inside of us and stay at that edge of our awareness, just beyond what we can currently perceive about ourselves, the world, and stay in that uncertainty, that place of discomfort, of the unknown, until we can give birth to new wisdom from that place. Help us, water, to flow. Help us, water, to be able to move forward even when all we think we know falls away. We honor you and we thank you. And we call out to you, spirits of the North and earth, please help us to embody that strong heart that knows its worthiness, that knows our right to be here, that knows the magnificence of our cosmic divinity and feels our responsibility to bring that divinity out into the world in service of life. Please help us to be like the mountain people, rooted deep within the earth while stretching up into the heavens. And we honor you, ancestor helping spirits, you who guide us in coming back into relationship with the heart, you who knew what it was, even in times of challenge, times of uncertainty, times of sickness and strife, what it was to anchor oneself in the heart. And from that place of the heart, be willing to navigate towards the places where our heart was most broken and stand in that place and bring all of our tools and skills to bear in healing that place in a way that expands our capacity of heart so we can hold the truth of the reality we're in and the vision we're moving towards, and feel, even amidst the strife and struggle, the love all around us, and take actions from that place of bridging that gap that actually have traction and an ability to create change in the world. We honor you and we thank you. Please guide us this day. May these proceedings go forward in a way that benefits all living things. May what needs to be said, and may what needs to be heard, be heard. So welcome, Christina, and thank you for having me here to interview you today.
Thank you, Langston.
So Christina and I were talking about how right now, one thing we see a big absence of in a lot of different modalities and the vast array of the beautiful, skills that are available for people out there right now to engage in our healing work and step into deeper intimacy with our spirit and try to create change in the world. A big gap is around the heart and our emotions. And I wanted to interview Christina about that some, because the cycle of transformation and the teachings that Christina founded have been some of the greatest teachings of my life around increasing my own ability to deeply access the wisdom of my heart and bring it to bear to the times that we're in. So I'd love to start by maybe asking you, Christina, just how would you define the heart? Like, how would you talk about the heart? Obviously, there's the biological functions of our heart, but in addition to, alongside that, there's also this energetic or spiritual dimension of the heart we're talking about here. And I'd love if you could define a little bit more what you're speaking about when you use the phrase the heart.
This always makes me chuckle because, there's always that person that goes, the heart's a muscle, it's pumped, and, your emotions don't come from your heart, they come from your brain. And okay, yes, that's the factual science. It's like, all right, already, relax, right? We're not being naive of reality. But there's also more science, right? There's more science than that. And there's the history of Chinese medicine. And then right now, this real progressive science being done with the heart math people that speaks to the heart having two jobs. That, yes, no one's going to say the heart doesn't pump your blood through your body. Yes, it's a great big muscle and it's really important. Okay, yes. And what Chinese medicine understands is the heart as an organ also governs all the organs and helps them to all work together as a whole. So it, in a sense, creates the connection that creates the system. And it tends that and orchestrates that. And so when someone starts having, physiological trouble with their heart, honestly, anyone who's had, heart disease or heart problems can attest, everything else starts to fall apart too over time, because the heart has to be able to do its job to orchestrate everything. So that's historical and present day in the history of Chinese medicine. And then you have these lovely heart math people doing this new science. And, as a scientist, I have to say there was this moment in learning about the theories of relativity where I realized that science is only the study of what we have learned to measure. And the fact that we haven't learned to measure it yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And as a scientist, to come to terms with that is really important. And that's the moment at which I think someone comes into right relationship with science. Science is getting really beat up, right, in this last 4 years in the United States. Poor science. And the truth is, science, like any good tool, can be manipulated. But my point is, what the heart math people are doing is they're saying there is something here that up until now we haven't known how to measure. Let's figure that out. This is the mystery that we want to dive into. And what's interesting about that dive into that mystery of the heart math people is what they have reached into to understand even the questions to ask is a lot of sacred texts in all of these different world religions that hold these ancient texts that have to be translated through a bunch of languages, but that guide us to how do these ancient spiritual traditions help a person connect to their heart? What is the role of the heart in that tradition to give these modern day scientists an idea of even what questions we should be asking to actually begin to understand what is this thing about the heart that not only pumps our blood, right, but inspires us to talk about, oh, that thing you did, it just warmed my heart. Or when you did that, it broke my heart. Right? Now, we know those aren't literally true, but we feel it. And these feelings, this experience of life, right, which some people would argue, validates our superiority over other living things, which I don't subscribe to. But the point is this experience, this ability to love and be loved, that this quality inspires art. It inspires, so many of the things that we, frankly, right now in the pandemic, are really frustrated we can't get to, right? I mean, people are depressed because they can't do the things that nourish and cultivate their heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, their heart is pumping their blood, right? So the heart obviously does these two jobs. And so I'd like to get that argument off the table, right? And so what I feel is the piece that is missing today, vastly, and today specifically on this show, this piece that we want to talk about is the way in which our curiosity and growing understanding and learning to tend this other quality of the heart and its relationship, yes, with that place in the brain that generates our emotions and our feelings, right? Like, what is that relationship, and how do we grow conscious and wise in the tending and cultivation of it? And so to me, that's kind of the landscape that is it's still argued about whether or not it's real. And it's, to me, when I talk about emotions, I feel like what I imagine it feels like for a person of color to be forced into that situation to argue again that racism is real. Or for me as a woman to argue again that sexism is real. I feel like I'm constantly in this position, even with my colleagues, shamanic colleagues, of arguing again that our emotions are a real thing that carries a wisdom if we can learn to grow up, right, and become emotionally mature and be spiritual adults. Our heart plays a huge role in that. And I'll add one more piece. And the reason why is because what we get from these beautiful heart math people, which is absolutely true, is our heart is our primary manifester. What is going on in our heart is what manifests in the world. And so if we are brokenhearted, that is what we are manifesting in the world. If we are full-hearted, that's what we are manifesting in the world. Our heart, not our mind, not our affirmations, not this mental control thing, but our heart is our biggest manifester, and we are always manifesting every day. So we must learn to be in right relationship with the heart and our emotions if we want to manifest anything with intention and clarity and purity.
Thank you. Yeah. And so I think that's interesting what you just said about what is going on in our heart is what we are manifesting. And so I know when you say that, you're not talking about this idea that, if everyone was just more positive, then the world would be a better place. I know that's an anathema to what your philosophy and worldview. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about taking responsibility, in a sense, for our emotional life and what's going on in our heart, rather than just paste positivity over it.
Right. Yeah. Because we all know how effective relentless positivity is. Not. So what what I would say to radio show listeners, because you have this, massive archive at, whyshamanismnow.com, is, what Langston and I are really trying to talk about is really fleshing out what do we mean when we're talking about the emotional wisdom body. We talk about the mental wisdom body and the spiritual wisdom body, and how the mental and spiritual wisdom body can conspire to convince you you're having a robust spiritual practice that never lands here on earth, right? You never actually change, and you never actually change what you're creating in the world. You're just having a great time in your mental spiritual life and feeling better about yourself there, which isn't here. And so what we're talking about, is the emotional wisdom body, and the emotional wisdom body is very much is closest akin to the physical wisdom body. The heart and the emotions and the body, have great interplay. And now, obviously, they're all interconnected. Okay, but basically what we're talking about is this wisdom in the emotional energy body. And then the next thing that is important to understand, if I want to get to the wisdom of my heart, I have to start to understand the interplay between my beliefs, my belief about the world, my belief about myself in the world, and my emotions. Because our emotions and our mind are not, and our beliefs are not fixed. They are changeable, and they are meant to be changeable. They are mutable, and they influence each other. In other words, if I have a huge emotional healing, it will change my beliefs about the world. I mean, hell, when y'all fall in love, changes your beliefs for the moment about the world. It's a beautiful day, right? And then, of course, when things go sideways and our heart is broken, it changes our beliefs about and how we see things. And so these two things are in relationship. And the important thing about the emotional side of that equation is you can't work on it through the mental. You can only work on the mental side of that through the mind. That the emotional side of that you have to work on it through the emotional language and essentially through the heart. And so for me, I talk about it being in the heart, even though I know technically and scientifically that our emotions are coming out of our brain, because it helps me think about the separate energy bodies. I think about my work to cultivate, hygiene in my mental energy body, and my work to cultivate hygiene in my emotional energy body. And for me, it's just easier to be thinking about that happening in my heart, and then my physical energy body centering that in the dantian, down in the belly, and and so to think about those, where I go to sort of control central for the different wisdom bodies is different spatially in my body, just because it's easier for me to kind of keep things straight, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I wanted to say though about emotions and why it's not just relentless positivity, because relentless positivity actually isn't an emotion, by the way, people. It's actually a mental control pattern. It doesn't really have anything to do with your heart. And so because what I really mean about the emotions and the work of the emotions is recognizing the incredible tenacity and patience and perseverance and curiosity and compassion that is required to revisit why we feel what we feel when we feel it. And so first, we have to essentially go back into the initial sort of programming of why we feel what we feel when we feel it, which is our childhood and what happened in our family of origin and the events of our childhood. This is not news to everyone. So anybody, right? This is normal work. So I'm not surprising anyone here. This is not a great shamanic concept, right? This is why we have an entire field called therapy. But anyway, my point is, when we reinvestigate our childhood, we need to parse that distinction of recognizing there's a whole landscape of truth here that is also incomplete. It is also immature, which we can do as an adult. Now, and I don't mean immature in a judgmental sense. Oh, you're being so immature. I mean, technically speaking, you were at whatever developmental age you were at when you perceived that experience or that interaction in that way. I mean that technically immature. And there's nothing wrong with a 3-year-old perceiving things as a 3-year-old, right? Okay. So for us to gain access to our emotional wisdom body, we have to be able to get back into our childhood, which is that earliest level programming that's programming how we're experiencing things, and begin to parse that experience and recognizing what was true in the moment, but it's also incomplete and immature. And so we can put those experiences into perspective, because if we don't, then the wounding of our childhood drives our life. It drives us in our life. And that landscape created in the childhood that's then driving the emotions that we're having and driving our actions and our beliefs and how we see the world. And so it means we're not ever able to move into the adult that we've become. And so it also means we're not ever able to actually access the kind of emotions you and I are trying to talk about, which is the emotions that guide us through, the emotions that move us to, how do you feel your passion if you can't trust the wisdom of your emotions? How do you sense which vision is truly your vision to bring into manifestation if you cannot trust the wisdom of your emotions? My point is you can't, right? And so the work is that being able to access that original landscape and parse through that distinction between true and not complete, and then do the work then to, as the current time person, to supply the emotional support, whatever needs, to the you that's stuck in that past place, and bring them into present time. Because when we do that, we release that old landscape of beliefs and unresolved experiences and stuff that happened that keeps us programmed to respond the way we're responding. And then we begin to come, the way I think about it is we begin to be able to move to this place that I call emotional neutral, where we get to this place where we are now actually beginning to be the person who in the moment is actually in charge. I don't mean in control of everything, but in charge. In other words, I am in my sovereignty. I understand the power of my choice, and I am here as an act of self-determination. And then any reasonable human being goes, shit, now what, right? And so part of the point is the first place I reach into then is my heart, to know what is the full experience of the reality in this moment, not just mine, but those that I'm with, be they human or non-human. I find so much of the non-human world, it's nearly impossible for me to communicate with in my mind. But it is really easy for me to begin to understand if I have that sense of dropping my awareness out of my head into my heart and experiencing the physical reality around me, in essence, through my heart, which is actually technically through my body, right? And so a lot of the language is somewhat metaphorical, but there is science that backs it up. So I don't feel that I'm just, being poetic to the point of lifting off into no man's land. So my point of all of this is, it is true that the typical Westerner, not just here in the United States, cannot just off the shelf at 24, 34, 44, 54, without ever having explored any of this, go, oh, I'm just going to trust my emotions now and they'll guide me through. Because they won't. I guarantee you they won't. They'll guide you back into the unresolved patterns of your childhood. They'll guide you back into shadow, which is fine if you want to do some work. But what I'm talking about is, instead of spending my life making my life create that for me, I'm talking about recognizing that process needs to happen on purpose. And it can happen on purpose. And so I can bring myself into this place where I'm moving towards this emotional neutral, where I'm not being driven by the past, but I can actually be here in the moment and connect into myself and begin to use that emotional guidance and wisdom of my heart to direct me towards my future. And so for example, that would answer that kind of question where someone goes, well, I don't know my passion. I can't feel my passion. Well, half that problem is most likely your passion and your permission to feel it. One way or another, there's something going on there around passion. But the other part of that problem is your willingness to feel. And that brings us back to the emotions and back to the heart.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that completely answered your question.
Yeah, it does. And it just makes you think of, I was trying to explain, teaching the energy body clearing class recently. It's really hard for people to move out of this addiction to perceiving everything through the mind and actually allow the heart to lead and the mind to sort of track and follow. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of teaching some of these skills to people. And so I found this metaphor of like sort of moving into ocean depths and making whale songs and then listening for the other whales that were like singing back to you. And so what I'm hearing in your talk about the connection between the emotional body and the physical body, it's like the physical body, in a sense, is that ocean, like that we have to learn how to get into so we can actually receive the whale songs when they come back to us, which is sort of that emotional body's wisdom that's coming to us, and then take action on it. And I think so often there's this, even when we do, like in many of the modalities today, even when we do manage to begin to access the wisdom of the physical body, rather than perceiving that emotional information from the heart as wisdom to engage with, there's this pathologization of that wisdom. And so instead it's like, let's kill the whales, like, okay, now that we've found this emotions by being in our body, they're unpleasant, so let's discharge them and get them out because they're traumatic and we don't want to feel them anymore, And there's beautiful somatic modalities. There's times when that really is necessary, that emotional discharge to sort of release old stuckness and come back into a reliable relationship with our emotions. But I also see this just pervading philosophy in so many different modalities, whether it be like somatic physical body modalities or like mental analysis or cognitive behavioral therapy, or even many Taoist approaches that pathologize the emotions as something that needs to be cleansed or regulated or controlled versus to be danced with and engaged with and help us to receive their wisdom through. So I guess I'm just curious if you would speak at all to, it sounds like as HeartMath is looking at these ancient texts, that it was understood in most pre-contact indigenous cultures that the heart was important and the emotions were pretty central in a certain way. And I'm just curious if you have a sense of why did we go so far away from that in culture today?
Well, I have two answers to that. So the first part of the answer is, that part in these traditions, at least the way they're practiced here in the Western world, because we can't really be sure that where they are practiced in their original form, people aren't practicing them in a fuller way. So I just want to acknowledge that piece. But here in the Western world, yes, there's a great deal of bypass around the emotional piece, or as you said, the purging or cleansing or whatever. Now, to be fair, to the extent that they're actually referring to that childhood-inspired landscape that I was talking about, and a lot of that is frankly wounded child, but I didn't want to get distracted by that by bringing it up. But anyway, but to the extent that they're talking about their emotions, they're not incorrect. They're not right either, but they're not completely wrong either. Because as I've just said, we do need to deal with that landscape, because otherwise our emotions are not in the moment and true to us in the moment. They're coming out of the past. So maybe one thing we could say is that that awareness in those traditions is being misinterpreted and applied to the emotions of the current time self, the adult emotions. The idea that somehow as adults we should not have emotions, we should not be moved by emotions, right? Yes. And so I'm just trying to be really fair today and sort of look at that from lens like, why would they even say that? Because it's so completely wrong. Why would they say that? Well, the one way we can understand it as right is they maybe are speaking about those kinds of emotions that are coming out of the past and hijacking you in the present moment. Okay. Now, with that said though, so I guess I'm listening and I'm thinking and I'm wondering, where did all of this come from? And, I'm thinking back, and I think to connect some dots in my history to really understand where I'm coming from with this is, by no conscious design, but the weird flukes of my life, my waking up began with clearing. That was really my first step into starting to wake up. And so I began the waking up phase clearing that childhood emotional landscape. And that gave me a tool that continues for me today to be what I consider my most important tool, which is why, of course, we invest so much energy in teaching it online and offering it as broadly as we can. Thank you, Langston, and everyone else on the team and Jane and everyone supporting us in doing that. So what that means, though, so I'm 20, I'm in my early 20s when this is happening. It means I'm experiencing everything else I learned on top of that from that foundation of emotional zero. Now, obviously, I have had many things to clear since then, so I'm not saying I was perfect to do that. But just for the sake of today's show, basically, I already realize I need to be responsible for these childhood emotions hijacking me in the moment and stay here in present time as an adult for every single system I learned after that. And I have always sat in the room wondering why I was having a different experience than everyone else. And I don't mean a better experience. I just mean so fundamentally different. And over time, with much reflection, what I've come to realize is my experience, whether it was a psychological process I was learning, whether it was, I guess, what we would now call more of a life coach process I was learning, a shamanic process I was learning, qigong, some sort of spiritual process. It didn't matter what system I was studying and internalizing. It was being internalized on that emotional zero place with an understanding it was my responsibility to get from kid to adult whenever I got hijacked, and that I had the tool to do that. And so I learned different systems than everybody else at the same time. That's been a very strange experience for me, and also felt very isolating and made me feel very alone, frankly, because I could never figure out, why am I the only person in the room having this experience? It was very weird. But I realize now it's because for me, everything was being processed mentally and emotionally as an adult. Through all of this learning, every trial and tribulation and transformation, everything that was happening was being processed on both of these levels simultaneously. And I ended up then, as a result, with a different system than others were gaining. And so, in a sense, if you engage in any spiritual, psychological, whatever teaching with this assumption that these childhood emotions need to be purged, released, whatever, controlled, whatever, you will learn a different system. That is the only version of the system that can be understood through the mind. And it's not that the mind doesn't have a version of the system, but it only has that which the mind can perceive. And the mind can only perceive what it's prepared to perceive. What the heart does, what I experienced the heart doing in all of this learning of these different systems over time, is what the heart does is transform. The heart is this chaotic, wild thing, and by nature, and it's constantly transforming. And so it's constantly preparing the mind to see something different. It's constantly changing the mind's capacity to perceive. The mind isn't changing the mind's capacity to perceive. The heart is changing the mind's capacity to perceive. The mind is ordering it and organizing it and creating it into a coherent system that you can use to structure your life. And then the heart has life experience from that perceived reality that upsets the whole apple cart again, and the mind learns and it begins to structure and perceive. So that's been my experience. And so it puts me at this place now, decades later, of really seeing so clearly at this time in our country and in our world how the absolute mental dominance that is part of a colonizer thinking and part of white supremacy, this absolute need to control with the mind, because if you allow that wild thing of the heart to start doing its heart thing, it will change the structure, because it can't not. And what the true mystical teachings understand is it's supposed to work that way. They're supposed to work together. And actually, most of the spiritual teachings at their higher levels talk about how the mind is really meant to just follow along behind the heart and keep things organized. That's really its job, is to work with the heart to order that chaos, to notice the patterns, to find to track the particular glitter in the particular idea that is yours to do, that's just a little bit more shiny than all the other great ideas that are other people's to do. So what I see in these systems is that this is a bit of a leap, not in my mind, but it was a bit of a leap, I don't know. Anyway, what I see in these systems is essentially uninitiated people in the heart, uninitiated in the heart, people processing these systems, becoming the teachers of these systems, and continuing to teach more uninitiated people in an uninitiated way. So it's the version of the system that can be understood through the mind, without the constant life-giving, re-inspiring, renewing quality of the heart, and the heart's really truly everyday healthy emotional ability to upset that apple cart, and to invite us to find a deeper understanding of the teachings. And so the immature way to understand that would be that it just all keeps changing. It's something different all the time, constant novelty. But what I'm meaning is that our mind's ability to perceive those teachings goes deeper. Back to our whales, right? But it's the same set of teachings, but now the mind can see it differently. And a true set of teachings worthy of dedicating your life to will keep unfolding in that way. That is a path of mastery. If you have a set of teachings that starts to crumble that first time you begin to question it, and you grow more aware through it and start to look for it to deepen, and it just falls apart, you shouldn't be dedicating your life to that anyway. And the fear that that's going to happen and what you've dedicated your life to is one of the main reasons people don't question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely something that's rare nowadays to find, that something that doesn't crumble when you really scratch beneath the surface and really follow on that path of heart devotion with it. And I feel really lucky to have found paths and traditions where that was true. And I guess I'm curious, within all of that, what do you feel like we lose as a collective when we don't have access to that ever-changing, wild wisdom of the heart and ability to continue deepening our relationship with ourselves and our lives through the wisdom of the heart versus through the sort of dominating mind that can only be with what it already knows and already perceives and is prepared for?
The first thing we lose is adults.
Mm.
We're all just highly skilled wounded children. The second thing we lose is justice. Because injustice is a quality the mind can rationalize, but the heart cannot tolerate. The next thing we lose is truth, because again, truth is something the mind can start to rationalize and start to play with, as we are deeply experiencing in the United States right now. I don't know how bad it is in other Western worlds, but people's utterly giving up on their responsibility to track what is true and just starting to live in utterly false worlds is really dangerous right now. So we lose relationship with truth. And I don't mean personal truth. That was back to that. Okay, So let me say why this has to do with the heart, which is back to what I said earlier in the show. If I, in my young adult life, have learned to parse that truth between this was my personal truth at the time when I was 4, and now I understand that yes, it is still true, and it is incomplete and immature, which allows me to let that 4-year-old off the hook, clear whatever that 4-year-old is holding on to, and to come into being a present time person and understand my current time truth. And then in my spiritual practices, what I come to understand is in this moment, I have a personal truth, but I have a much greater potential. So I have a much bigger truth to grow into. It's not a different truth. It's a bigger manifestation, or truer, or more refined, or whatever. But I have a possibility of a bigger presentation of that truth. And so again, now we have a small truth and a big truth again. And so if my spiritual practice and my work to grow up emotionally has given me this skill to parse truth, small personal truths and greater truths, and this is the reason we in our practice are constantly, intentionally, through our practices, we place our personal truth in connection with the below and the above, so that we are constantly noticing that the bigger truth is bigger than my perception of my personal truth right now. And so I have a room to grow into now. It's the same thing with boundaries and limitations. I need to honor my limits and boundaries and honor the limits and boundaries of others. If I don't like my limitations right now, I accept that small personal truth in the moment, and then I seek what is necessary to change that limitation. I want to grow to be able to be whatever more, but I can't just step over my boundaries and limitations and harm myself. I have to address that limitation. So these are all examples of how, if you're already in the practice of noticing and parsing the nuance of my personal truth and a larger truth, and being in relationship with that in a really healthy, grounded way, then you recognize this is one of the many responsibilities of being an adult. And that in a world that is filled with all of this information, it's your responsibility to parse that truth. Where is that greater truth that is not anybody's personal truth, but is that larger truth of the reality that we are all sharing? This is the beauty of shamanism, right? Is it really looks at and works with that real reality that is underneath the apparent reality we're all living in. That there is a real reality that is not relative, that we all live in. And that it is different from and supports and is the place from which everything comes in this energetic reality that we all share. And so for me, the first things that we lose when we refuse to embrace the responsibility for a healthy emotional life, and we don't gain those skills, is we do not have adults. Everyone is being driven by the unresolved issues from their childhood. I don't care how controlled, how zenned out meditated you are, what an awesome yoga teacher you are, or any of the other examples, or intellectual, whatever it is. If you have not investigated that landscape, you are not an adult, because your childhood is still driving you, because it's the older belief system, and it drives us especially in times of stress. Mm-hmm. So we lose adults, we lose justice, and we lose truth. And that's just the beginning of the list.
Oof, yeah. I feel that, absolutely. And, it's so interesting that you say truth. I was feeling into that, and at first, intellectually, I was like, that's interesting. I don't totally see the connection. And then the more you spoke, the more I felt into how the first time in my life when I really developed my own relationship with truth was after a long period of dissociation from my body due to different types of trauma and dissociated from my emotions a lot. There felt like there was always this gap between me and my emotions. I found the modality of interrelationship focusing, and I began to learn to enter into the wisdom of my physical body and the wisdom of my heart. And I learned the logic of that wisdom, of how when I was able to turn the sort of compassion and curiosity of my heart towards the sort of inner senses of my emotional body and my physical body, then it began to open and shift and flow. And I began to, my emotions didn't feel so stuck. And I began to come into relationship with myself on a deep level. And then that became a sense of truth, because especially as I was like sort of in seeker mode, exploring every tradition I could get my hands on, I realized that if what I was being taught or demonstrated or shared in that tradition didn't flow with that logic of the heart, the heart has this beautiful fractal quality that sort of is at the heart of everything. And so if what I was learning didn't follow that logic of the heart, it meant that there was something off, something not true. And that's where I first really learned that basic level of like instinctual, intuitive discernment, in a sense, through my coming into relationship with my heart as well. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, there's I think that there in a world in which the mind we are taught to have our mind dominate. It breeds that kind of dissociation you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it just unanchors us from this deep wisdom of our heart that helps us sort it all out. And it isn't it such a moment though, as adults in our discovering, when you find your way back to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And you
I
get
think,
to own that, right? Because you did the work. You did the practices, and you got that experience, and now it's yours, part of your teachings. Yeah.
absolutely. And I you use that word adult, and you said we lost adults as well. And I think it's important to emphasize that what adult means, because even the idea of an adult is almost inextricably linked to colonialism, in a sense, like this idea of this person in this suit going off to this 9-to-5 job, who has like their car and their like 2.5 kids. It's like there's this idea of what adult means that's so colonial, versus this indigenous sense of what it means to be an adult, a spiritual adult that includes, like you were saying, taking responsibility for your emotional life and being supported by true elders and dropping your family of origin baggage, reconnecting to this stream of wisdom of your ancestors who came before you. And so you're not just existing in a vacuum, you're building on this line of continuity and the sense of belonging that's beyond your family of origin. And then being connected to this relationship with the earth and sky, or the spirit world, as this, intimate force that you're in relationship and connection with. So your parents don't have to be these divine beings that you're looking to for all your guidance and advice. And then being reminded of that essence of what you're here to do, all of which allow you to be in healthy relationship with that, inner child who can move into the unknown with joy and laugh and play and engage with the beauty of the world, and that inner sage or elder who can, make those measured choices and take responsibility for our power. And I think that idea of what an adult could be, this being that's so in touch with both of those energies and being able to flow through them effortlessly, is so foreign to our sense of what it means to be an adult, that sort of like strict, rigid colonial concept of that idea.
Well, and something nobody wants to grow up into, right? They don't want to do that.
Exactly.
So it looks really boring and awful, right? Yeah. And that is, of course, a good point. Is like when I'm speaking about adult, I am speaking about those taking responsibility to be that quality of person in the world, where you're also taking responsibility for the mind. There's some great shows in the archives with Brad Fracchini about not letting your mind run off in these they're in that tradition as trickstery stories, but basically you take responsibility for the hygiene of your mind. I mean, that I really serious when I struck upon, calling these shows many years ago about energy body hygiene, that each of these wisdom bodies has a hygiene that we need to address in the exact same way that we are responsible for our physical body's hygiene. And that's what I mean by being adult, is you take responsibility for your hygiene because you understand that everything you do affects others, that you are connected to everything.
And that understanding is coming not from the mind having a sense of duty or obligation solely, but from that understanding in the heart, that visceral experience of that connection.
Exactly. And that the flights of fancy in our mind are not personal, obsessive journeys to indulge in, but the flights of fancy of the mind, our ability to connect to that greater dreaming and understanding, as an adult, what is my role in this? How do I guide my family? How do I support my children? Like, what is my role in this larger thing that's evolving here? Not, how do I protect my own? How do I hoard more, right? But how am I participating in this larger dream that is unfolding here? Like, for me, those are all the qualities of an adult. And so, frankly, when people are behaving as I see the majority of adults behaving around me, I just see a bunch of children. And that behavior at different childhood developmental ages, it's completely normal and healthy. It's just really unhealthy and unattractive and dangerous when it's still happening in grown-ups.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so just to really ground what we've been talking about today, I'm curious if there's sort of like advice you'd have in terms of a thing to do or a challenge for people for this week in terms of moving out of that bypassing in the heart and back into relationship with that wisdom of the heart and the emotional body.
It's tricky because you almost have to give a challenge for people that are completely 100% have succeeded to shut down their emotions and live very distant from their emotions. I realize that's a possibility. It's never been something I've managed to achieve. I don't have that capacity, but a lot of people do go there. So it's like there needs to be a challenge for that, for people that live in that space. Now, and all of these spaces I'm talking about, we've all cultivated to survive the system we're living in. I'm not judging or blaming anybody. Judgment. We all got here honestly. And then I would also give a different challenge for people that are aware of their emotions, or potentially too aware of their emotions, to the point where it distracts them from what they're trying to do in their day. Right?
Well, I have one little challenge I could give for the people who feel very distant. One practice that was really helpful for me was taking time every day for a period of time. I just set a period of time and I committed to it, taking 5 or 10 minutes to just write a letter to my heart. Really just speaking to my heart, and then put the timer on for another 10 minutes and write from my heart to myself, just receiving whatever my heart wanted to express back to me in response to the letter I had written to it in real time. And I did that for each day, even the days I didn't feel like showing up or felt like nothing was coming. I would just keep my hand moving, let whatever was coming, and maybe I'd find the thread, maybe I wouldn't. But that discipline of showing up into presence through writing to my heart each day really helped me just begin to enter into a flow of communication that was there. And I actually just recently, there was a client I was working with who tried this out, and they had this deep problem with feeling their heart was completely constricted. They couldn't enter it at all. It was completely inaccessible to them. And the second they started writing to their heart spoke up very clearly to them and said, I'm not constricted. You're constricted around me. I'm fine. If you would just let me be, I would have plenty to say to you, And just in one time of doing this exercise, I got this profound message that led to this beautiful clearing of the part of them that chose to constrict around their heart to survive. and then opened up into this deep relationship with their heart now. And so, yeah, I encourage people who feel very distant, just try that out. Try setting a little practice for yourself, just taking 10 to 20 minutes out of your day and being kind of rigorous with the amount of time you set, so you have to keep your hand moving that whole time, and just first writing to your heart and then letting your heart write back to you.
That's beautiful. I have one for people that do feel a lot of emotions, or just feel their emotions, or could even, if they stop to check in, they would be able to feel their emotions. And that would be to either set a timer if you don't normally notice your emotions until kind of the end of the day when you're exhausted, or whenever you're noticing your emotions rising in the day, to take a moment. And this is an act of curiosity. It is not an act of judgment, but it's just an act of curiosity and compassion. Take a moment and settle into what you're feeling really deeply. Like, try to get a sense of, if you had to name it, what would you name that feeling? And this is totally outside of the story of whatever's going on, but just really tune into the feeling you're feeling, or the emotion you're feeling. And then just ask yourself how old you feel. And if you allow the presence of the heart, as you just said, Langston, to honestly respond to about how old you feel. It's not an intellectual question. It's just this felt sense of, in this moment of this sadness or this moment of this joy, how old do I feel? You notice sometimes you'll feel your age. It's your feeling you're having in the moment. But I think you'd be really surprised to realize how often you do not feel your age. And the point of that is just to start to notice in the emotions that move through your day, or move you in your day, how much of that emotional content is coming out of the past, and is this emotional content we've been talking about that is really this unresolved childhood life still driving your emotions. It's an interesting practice, and just to commit to do that for a week, for example. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Christina. I really appreciate you being here this week. And I wanted to, I just look forward to continuing this conversation next week as we move more into what does it look like to have a healthy relationship with our authentic emotional response. And I thank you, Earth below, and I thank you, sky above. I thank you, sacred elements, air, earth, water, and fire, and the heart that unites us all.